Thank you, Skip, both for the invitation and the kind introduction. I want you to know the feeling is mutual. We didn't always agree, but we always were agreeable. I see others in the audience that I cannot say the same thing for. But I do see persons in the audience who I have had the privilege of representing. I even see someone that I fathered, my son John. At the last program I attended a few minutes ago, where Coach Nolan Richardson was the speaker. Coach, would you stand a minute? I had the privilege of also being on stage with a former partner, Phil Kaplan. And I see in the audience a former employee, Griff Stockley. Most of you all don't know that Griff worked for me years ago when he was fresh out of Mariana. And at that time, I didn't have the slightest idea that Griff was sincere about civil rights coming from Mariana. Now, that was one of my stereotypes, and Griff, I want you to know that. I came to realize soon after you were there that your commitment was sincere and devoted and continuing, and for that I'm grateful. And I see the Governor Tucker, and former Mrs. McMath, Mrs. Tucker. I see so many people here that I've related to. Governor and I didn't always get along. We fought about legislation a lot. He usually won. But we made the point, and sometimes the legislation was modified to reflect different perspectives. And I see others around too numerous to individually identify by name. But I do want you to know that I am sincerely grateful for the invitation and for its occasion. I had the privilege in 1958 of graduating with a class honored to hear Martin Luther King right after he had become the acknowledged individual leader of the civil rights movement. And when I graduated from Yale Law School in 1964, I again had the privilege of being before him and in his midst when he received an honorary degree from that institution as I received my law degree. And during the years, I had occasion to work with him. So that it is especially honorable, and a special honor for me to be here today and talk about Martin Luther King. All of us have Martin Luther King stories, and I'm sure as time goes on, more of us will have known Martin Luther than he ever knew him. I remember when Skip asked me to make the appearance today, he told me that, John, you're a legend in civil rights. And I said, well, I appreciate that. I took it to be a compliment as a reflection of what he considered to be my work and its importance, at least as he perceived it. But I then hastened to note to him that legends are either folk heroes or living dead men who are walking. In other words, we're perhaps relics who have outlived our usefulness. I assure you that I don't think I've outlived my usefulness, but there are a lot around me who think I have. He gave me the subject from civil wrongs to civil rights. And I guess somehow or another that was to give me leeway or latitude to speak about anything that I wanted to that related to the past, the present, and where we may be going in the future. Before I get into what I want to say, I want you all to know that also in this room is the president of Philander Smith College. Today he gave the most eloquent statement of who we are as a people and how we are misunderstood and misrepresented, especially when we are reflected through the writings of Martin Luther King. Those writings, he indicated, often give license to people to say that King would have been against affirmative action, that he would have been against the elevation of black people except as they sought individually to claim their rights. But he gave the most eloquent presentation that I've heard, and I think that endeared me forever, Doctor, to your institution and to you, because that institution is most important to the evolution of African American people. Now, for those of you who really are unfamiliar with me, I think that I'd just like to say a few things about who I am and why I'm here. I describe myself as a longtime foot soldier for civil rights. That is to say that in my life, early on, because of circumstances, I've had to take stands. When I was 16, I was admitted to the University of Texas, and then upon seeking to enter or enroll, told that I couldn't, in 1954, attend that school because Brown II had not been decided, and they wanted to wait a while to see what the Supreme Court was going to say at the second time around. Well, that was the first time that I learned about pretext. That wasn't the real reason they turned me down. The real reason was that one of the people who had some real talent, football talent, said that he was going to play football for the Longhorns. He was one of the 5 others. So when he indicated that he was going to play football for the Longhorns, the Southwest Conference and University of Texas and the others said no, but they didn't say it directly. They used subterfuge. That was the first. In Pine Bluff, where I went to college after being rejected, I rode buses largely at the urging of 2 people, Wiley Branton and George Howard. I guess some of you, it's all right to disclose that. Well, George Howard was state president of the NAACP at that time. And the purpose at that time of riding the buses was to sit at the front so that I could get arrested. Well, I wanted to know why, and he said you need test cases in order to be able to bring the issue before the court. And then they persuaded me, though I could neither swim nor had any money, to go to the white swimming pool and seek to gain admission, which I did. And they turned me down, but nobody would arrest me. But had they allowed me to enter that swimming pool, I wouldn't have been able to swim. But if they had said, come in, I didn't have the money to gain entry. In my early years, while in law school, I worked for Wiley Branton at this voter education project. And later, during that time and afterwards, worked with and marched with John Lewis, Dr. King, Bill Hanson in Arkansas, who some of you may remember, Ben Greenwich. And I was mentored not only by Branton and Howard, but by Daisy Bates and Jack Greenberg. And after finishing law school, I represented the SNCC workers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee workers, who put their bodies on the front line in order to make sure that the example was set that we would no longer take back seats. And in school, I had the opportunity to be classmates with Holmes Norton, Wright Edelman, Gary Hart, and Jerry Brown. Afterwards, when I came here, I was able to sue some of the most notable companies in the state and in the world, and some of the most distinguished governors. In fact, I think I hold the record for having sued Bill Clinton the most of any person in the United States. And that's only so because in order to sue the state, there is a requirement that you have to oftentimes sue the titular head of the state, even though that person may not be directly responsible for the institutional practice which is being challenged. So it may be said, Skip, that I have had some opportunity to influence the state of race relations in Arkansas today and perhaps some other places. I do think that some of our early litigation resulted in a number of places making early strides in changing their employment practices so that there were changes that were more positive. We sued the banks, and as a consequence, the banks began to place black people into important positions and onto director positions. We sued Allied Telephone, which later became Alltel, and they learned their lesson, and then they went and learned how to put their employment house in order. So when they were able to make a $1 billion sale this last year, there were no human relations issues that prevented the sale. So I think that there is something to be said for litigation that is in the nature of agitation, One person called me, I think the Democrat, among others, called me an agitator. Well, there is benefit to an agitator. An agitator is that portion of a washing machine which takes the fabric and beats it and beats it and beats the soil, the unclean properties from it. Well, that's what litigators do, and that's what perhaps I did, though it was not necessarily my intent to just beat up on people. Today we assemble because of and perhaps to honor the legacy of Martin Luther King. That legacy is so well known that I will not dwell upon it. However, his dream, which we all recount, as he always reminded us, was the American dream. It was one of justice, of equality, of meaningful opportunity for each of us to be an integral part of a dynamic, prosperous America, where race was a fleeting memory and equal enjoyment of life's benefits abounded. The occasion presents opportunity for both review and reflection of our past, especially since Brown in 1954, Montgomery in 1956, the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, and of Martin Luther King in 1968. It further presents an opportunity to understand the work which remains if we are to overcome the legacy of the past. I began by asking, what were we promised? And that takes me back a bit to the years of slavery and thereafter. Upon release from slavery, African Americans, then not necessarily called people, were promised equality, then told that it had to be under separate conditions. The promise was not of reparations, but of what was needed to survive. And the government thought, and it is reflected in writings several places, that 40 acres and a mule would suffice. But for most people who were freed, they are pretty much like the people in Haiti. When they were freed, they had no place to go. They had no support system. They had nothing, and they had nowhere to go in order to be able to claim their 40 acres and a mule. So that 40 acres and a mule never came except in limited fashion, nor did equality. Relief from the promised inequities ended in 1865 with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln 1 week after his second term of office began. Ironically, that was almost 100 years before John Kennedy was likewise to be assassinated. No successor presidents after Lincoln until Franklin Roosevelt manifest an intent through policies, words, or deeds to follow through upon what Lincoln said in that famous document, the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm reminded that FDR's appointees, notably Justices Black, Douglas, and Frankfurter, were among the 9 black-robed men who wrote Brown versus Board of Education and ushered in the era which, after mass protests by black and other colors of Americans, that Dr. King came to lead and personify. The end of 2 nations and its replacement with but one where equality and non-discrimination abounded. And under that new nation, we all came to have hopes that schools would be integrated. We'd have an opportunity to sit next to each other and to have our worth and our abilities tested one-to-one in a context where objectivity abounded. Jobs were to be open to all and fair wages paid. The conditions which allowed for and encouraged one race mass incarceration for law violations would be ameliorated. Health care for all would be improved, and governance would be shared, and so on. That was a promise of the Constitution, reflected in the Brown case, reinforced in the Orville-Forbes Little Rock school desegregation case, and other cases. The United States government would fully support delivery of rights to the former slaves and their progeny in all quarters, we thought. However, we learned soon that those promises, implicit and explicit as they were, would not be kept. Just as had happened upon our release declared in the Emancipation Proclamation, rather than address the problems of discrimination systematically at one time, the nation's leaders retreated and made it a matter for each individual African American to be required to take personal action whenever he or she felt discriminated against. That was an impossible burden to place upon millions of African American people who felt discrimination every day of their lives. How could we file a lawsuit? No lawyers, no money, no receptive courts. And that would have burdened the courts. It was an impossible task, but it was what we had to work with at the time. We had to do that and take personal action. The most notable example of personal action that in turn motivated group support was that of Rosa Parks. When she refused a backseat on a public bus, she presented not only a court case, but she, by example, caused hundreds of local people, thousands of people in the South and across the United States, to come to her support and to thereby be energized. She set the stage for the development and evolution of a 29-year-old preacher who would become a Nobel laureate and one of the world's great citizens, Martin Luther King. From that, the rest of history is well known, which may be summarized again as promises made but unkept by this nation. That may be viewed by some as too harsh of an assessment. We see great examples of progress in our nation. This gathering is an example of progress in our nation. We see other examples. 2 Supreme Court justices, Marshall and many lower court justices, even Supreme Court justices of at least 2 southern states, business leaders of great American corporations like American Express and Xerox, deans of prestigious law schools, including one of our own, Cynthia Nance, record-breaking athletes, inventors, surgeons, and the list goes on. Most importantly, the list has at its top the President of the United States, Barack Obama. And in this sense, it must be noted that while Barack is accused now of being Negro, whatever that may mean in this time, his wife is not. She is purely and plainly and clearly black, having grown up in the project, as did the current CEO of Xerox. So it, in terms of progress, is a reflection that our people have had opportunity to rise from the depths of lack of opportunity to the heights of opportunity. We have, as Dr. King wrote in his first book, made great strides toward freedom. Those strides which are real demonstrate what opportunity may yield when and if afforded. The masses of African American people, however, have not had, do not have, and likely will never have the same real opportunity to demonstrate what contributions they can make to this great nation. For they are precluded from doing so by our lawmakers, judges, and members of various power structures in the world. Let us look at a number of examples. I must note here, as I take a moment, that my longtime adversary in the school case is now on the same side as I am in the school case as we go forward against Pulaski County, and he's here. That's Chris Heller, and Fred Ursford, the former president of the Bar Association, and Clay Finley, who's really one of the people carrying the ball to try to make sure that Little Rock keeps the rights that it earned during the desegregation settlement. But I note these things. The public schools are for all, but in reality, in the South, They are populated by and sometimes educate or miseducate mostly poor, largely minority children. That number is increasing every day. Secondly, white children in biracial towns are largely educated in private schools which are unregulated by the state. Please note that in mostly one-race towns, private schools are rare except for parochial schools. 3, public schools actually work to educate and to secure white, now minority children. Several local schools provide great examples of this fact, and they do this by separatist practices. There's a great effort to make sure that they are well treated. And they get well treated, and they get privilege, and they get opportunity, and they go to the best schools, and they come back home. There are many people in this room whose children have gone away and come back home and do real well. But an ironic thing about life for us is that if we do well here, we have to go away, do well, and then we come back and perhaps get honor. But we don't have much opportunity locally in order to be able to expand, to demonstrate what we've learned and our worth to the community. The public schools, and I must say that I didn't come from Little Rock, I came from Hope by way of several places. And so many other people, I don't think Bruce came from Little Rock, Bruce Moore. I mean, there are not very many examples of local people who have risen, who are black. Now, there are some, not enough. But that is not reflected in the white community. The public schools, like other areas of public service, are rapidly becoming places which provide jobs. And pardon me if I offend somebody, but they provide jobs to white people who quite often are culturally disconnected from African American people. That is to say that the more blacks stay in the schools, the more they are taught by whites who know nothing about their culture, heritage, and perhaps have limited relationship to the struggle of black people so as to make the necessary contributions to the education of those children. And that results in poor education of our children, retention, further stereotyping, and it often then results in incarceration and later non-contribution to the society's economic advancement. The system of justice is set forth to provide equality under the law. Our federal courts exist for that purpose, especially where the 14th Amendment issues are presented. Now, most of you have heard of the 14th Amendment. That was one of the 2 amendments that the South had to embrace in order to come back into the Union. We've had some judges over time, and there are a lot of them, but I imagine 15 or 20, who have been distinguished because of their commitment to equal rights. And I'll just mention a few of them. Some of them are familiar to people who are lawyers who have been in the legal arena. Tuttle in Georgia, Wisdom in Louisiana, Johnson in Alabama, Richard Arnold in Arkansas, Gerald Haney in Minnesota, Warren and Marshall in the nation's capital. In my early years, on the other hand, a famous judge from North Arkansas who was associated with the Little Rock case was reported to say by Harold Anderson, then a lawyer in the case, that that judge would sit down over coffee with some of his peers and say, well, yeah, they want the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection. Let's give them due process, but we'll deny them equal protection. And that seemed to always be the case. We got a right to go to court and to be heard. And then almost every time we sought anything meaningful and consequential, we were told that, well, it's denied. You've had your day in court, and if you don't like what it is, then you go and appeal. And that put more burdens upon an already overburdened population with few resources. I've hastened to say that. You all think about it. If there were no, what would this city be like if there were no black population? What would this state be like if there were no black population? What would this country be like if there were no black population? Well, one thing's for certain, we wouldn't have very many federal judges, because federal judges exist basically to incarcerate black people accused of crimes, or basically to handle civil rights cases. The number of cases that are handled that don't involve minority people is very, very few. It's relatively few. It may be 20 or 25%, but we certainly would not need a number of judges that we have. And I think that really what happens is that the pendulum sort of swings. When you have the conservatives appointing these judges in order to repress black people, then the Democrats get in and they can't get rid of those judges since they have lifetime appointments. So they, in order to balance the thing and make it more equitable, try to perhaps have the number increased, and then they get some persons so that it'll be sort of offset. I don't know what's right or wrong, but I do know that that is a matter that often results in our not necessarily making progress. My subject relates to the subject of civil wrongs and, of course, civil rights. A civil wrong may be selecting a friend for a public position before announcing the position, and then afterwards fixing the standards in order to fit the selectee and to justify the selection. A civil wrong may be a white hiring official firing a black person in order to make room for a white friend or person. And I use white here now because only few people who are black are in positions where they can really make hiring decisions. That's relative. It's less than 10%, less than 5%. A civil wrong is the Southern Manifesto, which some of you may recall, which in 1954 was a response of 100 Southern legislators who came together in response to the Brown decision, and they said, these 9 white men have gone crazy. They made a mistake, and we are not going to follow what they say in saying that the schools and other walks of life had to be changed. Only 5 or 6 white persons who were in legislative positions in the South did not sign that. One of those persons was Brooks Hayes from Arkansas. And the others included Lyndon Johnson, Albert Gore, I think that was his name. It was Al Gore's dad. I think his name was Al too. Estes Kefauver, Ralph Yarbrough. Now, 5 out of 105, I mean, that speaks volumes. A civil wrong may be the legislature of Arkansas or any state enacting laws which it well knows favor one racial group over another, and then relying upon its court system to justify its discrimination by requiring proof of legislative intent to discriminate. For example, a benefit of the Arkansas lottery. We all heard that somebody won $25 million. I don't know who he was. That was wonderful. But a benefit of the lottery was to provide scholarships to Arkansas high school graduates. We all thought that was wonderful. I guess we still do. Is there anybody here who doesn't think that's wonderful? Can I see a name? Nobody. All of you think it's wonderful. But then the legislature set conditions for the scholarship. These are they. High school graduation. That's easy. 2, a 2.5 grade point average. Well, that's easy. And 3, scoring 19 on the ACT. And that may be easy. Thoughtful persons who follow the legislative process, however, know that most black high school students, beginning next year, will not be graduates from high school. They will receive certificates of completion from high school, not diplomas. So that disqualifies those persons. White students, on the other hand, will receive diplomas. Most of the people in the legislature know that most black students who graduate with diplomas will not have received grade point averages of 2.5 or below, or above. On the other hand, because of disproportionate placement of white students in AP classes, those students have enhanced grade opportunities, which almost guarantees them that with straight C's, they can't have anything but a 3-point average. The way that system works, for those of you who know, is if you get an A at an AP course, you get 5 points. B, 4. C, 3. D, 2. So most white students, being the dominant population in public school AP courses, are going to have a number of AP courses along with the regular courses, and they're going to have 2.5 averages, and they'll have diplomas. Then we come to the ACT itself. The average ACT score of African American students in Arkansas is 16. Check it out. State Department of Education is the source. Check it out. National tests show that it's in that range for persons even outside of Arkansas. So when you set that score, you know the likely number of people who will be able to meet that qualification. On the other hand, the average ACT score of white students is 21. What this means is that the state benefits will continue to flow disproportionately to white students to the detriment of black students. Now, you may say, well, they can all do that and learn and whatever. But remember, learning is a lifetime process. What you begin in kindergarten, you continue thereafter. And if you're retained in kindergarten, and then in the first grade, you're going to lose interest in school. And thereafter, you're not likely to be able to make even C's, all things equal with the best set of circumstances, which means that you won't be able to qualify for this scholarship. Now, a civil wrong is one secured to black freedmen because of the Civil War a civil right is one secured to black freedmen because of the Civil War by the 13th and 14th Amendments. In like fashion, a civil wrong may be described as the failure of enjoyment of a civil right. It may be, and these are examples that you all have all read about recently and over time. It may be unequal treatment as reflected in a police department, such as that of Pine Bluff, which is now a majority black police department, where the work conditions of white officers were found recently to be materially superior to those of black officers, albeit under the oversight of a black mayor. Now, segregation causes habits. It's systematic, and those who govern get caught up in keeping things as they are, and it doesn't matter whether they're black or white. I mean, oftentimes. Now, hopefully black people will be a little bit more sensitive than white because they've been the victims. But somehow or another, when you have a system, it's sort of hard, even with well-meaning people, for them to change that system. It also may be changing the rules to deny class honor to a black student in order to allow that honor for a white student, as we have found numerous times and in many places, including Little Rock, Gurdon, Stevens, Pine Bluff, and like. One of the things, and I don't want to take too much time, I hope I'm not boring you, but there was a situation where, and Chris was involved in this case. I don't think he had anything to do with its ultimate development, but there was a case at Hall High School where a black boy at the end of a school year was number 3 in class. Well, one of the students left. That meant that he would have been number 2. And then another student left right before school started, which meant that he would have been number 1. But all of a sudden, he's number 3. And what had happened was that the school officials said that, well, we reviewed the transcript of a student who transferred from a Northwest Arkansas school, and while she didn't have AP course credit, we decided that she had the equivalent of courses that would have been offered in Little Rock, so we weighted her grades, and she therefore is now number 1. And he still won't be number 2, because there's a young lady who came in from Tulsa where they give 6 points for an A, and she had more grade points than this boy. Well, we were able to administratively resolve that, so he did become the valedictorian, and well, last year he graduated from the University of Arkansas School of Medicine. But we see those things happening all the time, and I think that the idea here is that it's very hard to come to grips with the thought that black boys are often smart and they can do well provided they're given the opportunity. We've seen so many times the AP system manipulated in order to give favor to those who are already favored. It also may be having one punishment for a white policeman who rapes a child or a woman and another for a black citizen. I don't like to make personal reference, but let me tell you about the time when I was arrested. Well, I've been arrested twice. I didn't try to get arrested either of the times, even though I expected it. The second time, I decided to watch an arrest. And I saw a man stop some black boys and hold them over to the side, a policeman. And then he had another officer with him, and he wanted to know why I was observing. I was on the other side of the street. I had on my blue jeans, and I was innocuous, didn't have any weapons, and I kept my arm sort of like this. And when he asked what I was doing, I told him I was watching Pine Bluff's Finest in action. Well, he asked me for my identification. I hesitated, and then as I moved to my back pocket to get my wallet, he took my hands, handcuffed me, and then put me in the police car in front of my grandkids, and then whisked me off to jail where I had to stay for hours. But the point I'm making is this. What I saw was a pattern that happens all too often, unnecessary arrests of black boys. And it never occurred to me that policemen make arrests sometimes in order to obtain personal favors. It turned out that this policeman had been arresting black boys and had been becoming associated or involved with them. How can a little boy refuse a policeman who says that he wants him to go home with him? In this case, the only reason they didn't take me to trial was that it was learned that the fellow had taken two boys in earlier times and it caused them to engage in a sexual act. And he was being charged with rape. And then he was removed from the police force. But then equal justice comes into play. This man, you never read anything about that. You read more about my arrest than you did about that man. All right, you never heard anything about that. And then the man was given a $5,000 fine and probation. Now, can you imagine, all of you, white or black, can you imagine a black person doing that and getting away with probation and a $5,000 fine, able to go into his job the next day as he had done the day before, after he had pled guilty? That's not likely in this country. Now, a civil wrong is also changing the rules in a majority race, declining white population city, so as to allow that majority to increase its proportionate government status. This may strike a nerve. In the early 1990s, the Little Rock 7-member city board was constituted by 3 African-American persons. You all remember that, 3 out of 7. To refresh your memory, if you don't remember, they were Charles Bussey, Lottie Shackelford, and Les Hollingsworth. That pretty much reflected the population of this non-population increasing city, 43% to 57%. And I say non-population increasing. Little Rock's population has remained static. People move around, but the population remains approximately 180,000. The city changed the rules when it was aware that in future years this population would be increasing and the white population decreasing. And they came up with another system to allow 3 at-large positions to be created and imposed upon that system. And they knew at that time that at-large systems require, in order for one to win, a lot of money, a lot of publicity, a lot of support. And they knew that there still was polarized voting. So that meant that the black people would not likely win at-large seats. But they set it up to show that, well, the first time around, a black person won an at-large seat. And I think that was Jesse Mason. I may be wrong. But since then, to my recollection, no black person has won an at-large seat. So in almost majority, it is now, Little Rock is now a majority minority city. Some of you may not realize that, but more than 50% of this city is African American and Hispanic and minority. So in a majority minority city, we are secured with 70% dominant rule for the rest of, at least until it's otherwise overcome. Now the legislature allowed that, and this is the only place where they allowed that. If you look around, 1 man, 1 vote pertains. And then you have single-member districts. And the only places where you don't have that are those places where you have biracial populations. If you have biracial populations, the way for a minority to keep its influence is to have at-large elections, because they can win 2 out of 7. And to go with the 2 they're going to get by single-member districts, that gives them 4 out of 7. It is wrong for the 3 Pulaski school districts to take, it is a civil wrong for the 3 Pulaski County school districts to take $1 billion above their normal share from the state of Arkansas to address desegregation issues, and then to demonstrate no material gains in narrowing the achievement gap between black and white students over 2 decades. That is just absolutely wrong. I mean, you may not have, why did we put all this money there? I mean, something had to change. It wasn't just to pay teachers. It wasn't just to pay administrators inflated salaries or to buy buses. It was ostensibly to cause the improvement of the underclass. It is a civil wrong for school districts to accept money and to put in place programs to improve education of minority students. Then, for them not to educate them, blaming them and their parents, and then say, as Pulaski County now says, no, as North Little Rock now says, we didn't promise results, we only promised efforts. You may now ask, Mr. Walker, why on this day, when we honor Dr. King, do we highlight the negatives that divide us rather than the positives which unite us? In other words, what today, WDKD? What would Dr. King do? I submit to you, Dr. King would make some of the same points I have made, albeit in more profound, somewhat more appeasing language. Remember, Dr. King himself confronted injustice, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott, and ending with his march on behalf of Memphis garbage workers in 1968. Throughout his life, wherever he went, he was a confronter. He encouraged in confrontation, because that's the only way people come to grips with the issues before them. How can Governor Tucker be aware of ideas different from his when he has one set of experiences and I have another, unless we talk or unless I educate him to the folly of his beliefs? And somewhere along the way, that is the American way, somewhere along the way, we have a meeting of the minds which may or may not reflect one person or another person's singular attitudes. To Dr. King, injustice anywhere was a reflection of injustice everywhere. He opposed the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is unjust. He taught us that the best way for children to learn was with each other, not in separate environments where some were taught that they were more worthy and deserving than other children of their age. While he would encourage parents to be close in all ways to their children, he would oppose in-school tracking, manipulated governmental schemes by which to maintain the status quo. He would oppose the lottery and its government proceeds hypocritically delivered to those who already have as against those who don't. He would oppose the rules which allow pre-selection in the workplace and non-selection. He would oppose. Through it all, he would recognize that the opposition would be teaching and spiritual in nature. How do I differ in what I want to see for America, for Arkansas, for Little Rock from Dr. King? I don't differ. The late Dr. Rufus King Young put my wants, the wants of African American people, in simple terms in relating to a loaf of bread. Some of you may have heard that. To a white man hungry, the loaf would be an appeasement for his hunger. To the black man, the loaf of bread would be an appeasement to the black man for his hunger. The loaf represents justice, and it represents equality, as well as it represents food. The black man, in looking at that situation, would say, I want the same thing, same thing, same thing. I say to you, we all want the same thing. Let us confront the issues, all the issues which separate us, with the concept being the central focus of our thoughts and our actions. In this way, we can move our nation forward. This is the only way we can move our nation forward. We must be realists, and we must be committed by more than words on this day to the principles set forth by Martin Luther King, remembering that they are reflected in the Constitution. They are the American dream. The American dream is King's dream. The American dream is my dream. It is your dream. Let us get about our work. Thank you.
Ryan, you got a packed house here.
Yeah, thank you.
How are you? You got a question? All right, well, let's wait for the microphone. We're going to take a few questions.
A comment. John and I go way back, college. I am so very proud of you.
Talking to your mic.
Okay, I'm so very proud of you.
Thank
We've
you.
been adversaries, most people know. Very proud. I want to ask one question. I know it's an imbalance in the legislature, and I hope I'm not wrong, but I don't think I see a legislator in here. Why did I miss you know how I feel about academics. Did I miss the uproar about the scholarship from legislators?
Well, I understand. Your question is why, how did that happen? How did that happen? And look, that's really just a dramatic example that we can all identify with because there's a lot of money out here that we all want. But it was in the challenge scholarships and it's elsewhere. And when we look at things, you'll see that there are even more things. For instance, you don't have to be in high school, in a public school, in order to have your children go to free summer schools and get free tuition and other things. All you have to do is be a high-achieving student. So what that means is that the state provides more opportunities. Well, where we are in this state is simply this. We moved from a civil rights agenda to one where we thought that legislators would best represent the agenda, and meaning the needs of African American people. Well, what we learned, sadly to say, is that black legislators are like white legislators. They all have their own private interests. I don't know of any meaningful legislation that has been initiated on behalf of African American people that we can all identify by any black legislator. I don't know. Now, what does that say? What does that say? It means that our issues are not being raised by them, and what we do is we work like the legislators do behind the scenes to get some things done, and then we all have this attitude, or at least they have this attitude, that if you do things to help the general population, then black people will be helped as well. In other words, we all rise together, and that fails to give attention to the relative needs of African American people and the problems that keep one race down and cause another race to be elevated. I think some of them raise the issue. It's very difficult, in fairness to those 11 black legislators in the House, and maybe 12. They can't win on any issue because they don't have enough vote. And you still have the same factors which oppress and repress. The best they can do is get a little change here and a little change there. And maybe getting it to be 16 as a cutoff, 19 as the cutoff score was a concession because somebody may have wanted it to be 20. I don't know what the dynamics are, but we do have to hold our legislators more accountable, and then we have to ask them, what are they doing for us as contrasted to what are they doing for themselves or those close to them? Thank you for your question.
Okay, questions right here. Sylvia. Wait for the mic, Sylvia, please.
Is there something you can do now, or do you have to wait till a student is denied a scholarship, a black student is denied a scholarship?
Well,
because
let me tell you, that's where the courts come in.
And you...
I'll explain. That's where the courts come in. The state eliminated all of its overt laws requiring segregation. Now, the burden that has been created for dealing with those types of legislation is to demonstrate that there was an intent to discriminate. We can't simply use statistics. I mean, the statistical case is easy, but we can't use that, and the courts say, well, that's not enough. And one of the reasons I want to keep this case going for a little bit longer is because the state has a commitment to fulfill that it will not enact any legislation which has grossly harmful, disproportionate impact upon any citizens of this state. Now that means that arguably, I don't know if we'd prevail, but arguably we'd be able to use a different standard than an intent standard.
Questions? Let's see. Got a question. Ryan, this is Clinton Schools.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm a Clinton School
Yes.
student. I'm curious. I wholeheartedly believe that the legislation is definitely a way to go, is one route to be able to solve a lot of the current social issues that we have today. But as I was walking in the Martin Luther King parade today down Martin Luther King Avenue, I was looking at all these people and I'm like, what are the ways that we can mobilize individuals as well to be able to tackle some of these issues, whether that is lobbying the legislators or getting people into after-school programs or a number of things that we can get individuals within the community to rally around so that we can solve some of the issues that we're somewhat depending on people in power to do. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd be happy to share them. I think that things are not better in terms of race relations for us today than they were when I met Jim Guy Tucker or John Honey. They're not better because back then you had legions of people led by an old woman named Mrs. David Terry and joined by a now old woman like I am, an old man. I see her name there, Pat. I see her back at the back of the room, Pat Youngdahl. Those people came together and they promoted the notion that we have to solve our problems together. And they worked to that. There was an urban league. The NAACP was inclusive. There were organizations in the churches devoted to promoting race relations. There was dialogue. There was interaction. Things were happening. There even was, and Chris may remember this, there was even remediation of the achievement gap under Paul Mason. I don't know whether it was going up. It went up. And Paul caused this lawsuit to be filed in part because he wanted to make sure there were more white students in the mix. And then from that point on, everything went down. Student achievement went down, push-outs, dropouts went down, and everything. What needs to be done? I think that we have to have more people, white, committed to talking to black people and to working with black people and to confronting the issues and to addressing the issue and to holding people accountable. One of the things I must mention is that that kind of dialogue years ago caused me to get a significant benefit on behalf of a group of 6 boys who had been accused of rape of 2 white girls on the Little Rock Sandbar in about 1968 or 9 or 70. You may remember that. 1970. We were in court on that case. Wiley Branton was helping for 5 different times. And at the last time, I was able, or we were able, to negotiate a settlement of that case with Jim Guy Tucker when he was the prosecuting attorney for Pulaski County. Most of you all may not know that. And the person who was the lead defendant was a person named Clarence Bruce, whose sister later became Dr. Sandra Bruce. She became the department, the head of the state health department. But at any rate, Jim Guy sat down and we talked, and he said, how can we bring this to an end? The community is divided, but we need to put some closure to this so that there will be at least the appearance of justice. So we worked out a convenient resolution that didn't satisfy everybody, but it got the matter resolved, and it helped bring closure to the issue in a good way. We don't know whether the boys were guilty or not. But we entered a plea of guilty, but not on the charge of rape. We entered a plea of guilty on the charge of intent to rob. And we got them no time and no fine with an opportunity to have their sentences expunged. Now, to me, that's a win. But to the system, it may look otherwise. But we got those boys off because of the goodwill of a white person sitting in a position of power who knew at that time what was necessary in order to bring a matter of division in the city to closure.
Got a question right over here.
Hello, Mr. Walker. I have a question. With the lottery system, which is going to allow our kids, if they have a 2.5 or a 19 on their ACT, to get funding for school, the thing that I worry about is, even if they're able to go, will they be able to do it? Point one being because we have inflated grades, that the students really don't have a 2.5. Their math achievement is down as well. Also, what we have in our state occurring is that in a given time, it is not decided yet what we're going to do, whether we're going to have kids graduate with a certificate of completion or all end up with high school diplomas. What are we going to do with that? Because in that being a Trojan horse, that if we do not graduate all of our kids with the same thing, a high school diploma, those kids that do not have the standardized GPA or standardized exam in which will be given, when they apply for a job, who would you choose? The one with the high school diploma or the one that has something, coming out with something after years? Or when applying to college, who would you choose? The one with the high school diploma or the one coming out with something? So then what we have created is, what will we do with all these kids later, 5 years, 10 years down the road? How will we help them?
All right, well, that's easy for me. First of all, we don't really have a meritocracy in Arkansas or in America. All too often, I run into situations where, especially in school districts, where there are published qualifications to hold positions. You have to have a master's degree in order to be a principal. You have to have a master's degree to be in charge of finances. You have to have this or that. You have to have 2 years college. In many, many cases, the people holding the positions are high school graduates. Sometimes they're not even high school graduates. And then, when we start talking about how you get qualified, the people are given jobs, and then they get to go to a college. There's one college here in the state where all you have to do is apply, you get admitted, and then you make straight A's and you get, and it's a white college, and then you make straight A's and then you get your principal's diploma, and then you can go and become a principal. Now, if we were a true meritocracy, we would have standards. But you don't measure futures of people on the basis of tests which are not validated. It is very clear, Dr. Brown, that if the people in this room were to have their children tested, their children would probably test better than 16 or 19. But I'm not concerned so much about the children of the ones in this room as I am about that group of people who are not in the room or who may have other needs. It is very clear that as we look at the census, thousands of black people earn $100,000 a year. Thousands of black people have 6 years of college or more. We have a burgeoning middle class. But however burgeoning it is still not the equal of the white middle class. So that this is about class and how you overcome class. And this is about opportunity and how you provide opportunity. If the objective is to cause the least of our children to be able to meet identifiable criteria, then we ought to be about that, rather than trying to set up a system which rewards some for no fault of their own and punishes others. And I say for no fault of their own. It is pretty clear that when you look at the standardized tests, those people who come up in homes where you speak language like I do, and maybe I'm not that good, but others around like you do, you'll find that people who do well in language are going to do well on a test. Those who have experience with math and with budgets and who have two parents, they're going to do well on tests. Those people who accompany their parents to their professional endeavors, they're going to do well on tests. So we know already at the first, second, third grade who's likely to do well on tests at the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. So they don't have to be educated. All we have to do is just give them a test at the 11th grade, and then they claim their scholarship. Well, that's just not fair. The purpose of the scholarships ought to be what was said. Give every person an opportunity to go to college. We know this. The legislature has made it possible for anybody, and this is something surprising to me, anybody who finishes the 8th grade to be able to enter and enroll in a community college. Did you all know that? The legislation clearly says that if you finish the 8th grade, you can go to the community college. Now look at it. You got community college in almost every place. My hometown, Hope, Malby, come up the way. But there is discrimination again. Out of all 35 or so of the colleges, there is not one place which is headed by a black person. Not one. And the only one which gives the appearance of being headed by a black person is the one that was historically created for that purpose, AM&N College, now UAPB, where the person is the chancellor. So I think that we don't get caught up. Middle-class people will justify. I had a friend who's here in the audience who I won't embarrass. I had a friend in the audience who told me, well, look, my children did well. If my children can do well, then other children can do well too. Well, surely they can. But what about children who are homeless? Children who have a parent who works 2 jobs and is a single parent? What about children who have to go for themselves, who may go to school and not go to school? And juxtapose that with the private school system, where kids don't get punished if they don't go to school. Are you aware that the only people who get punished are the kids who go to public school? Largely white kids who go to private school can't get punished. They don't get in the juvenile justice system. Nothing happens to them, and then all they have to do is test out, and then they can get their college scholarship or whatever else it is. The system has to be equalized. It has to be made fair. But the objective has to be to extend opportunity to the least of our population if we are to be successful.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause to John Walker.